Introduction. As mentioned, my name is Will Porter. I have been at UC Riverside for about 6 years now. And it's a real honor and privilege to be here at the University of Utah and at the famed atmospheric science program that you have here. It's really exciting to be here and to meet some of the faculty that are working on some very similar kinds of problems and questions. My background is in physics and atmospheric physics, of course, and my tool is primarily modeling. I'm a modeler. I look at different types of ways that we can use modeling tools to apply those tools to different kinds of research questions that affect air quality and ultimately human health. Those are my main interests. I've got a number of projects that I'm working on right now. I'm kind of spread around different types of topics, loosely arranged around things that are very important in Southern California. So I'm very interested in wildfires and prescribed burns, which of course is a major concern in many parts of the world and country right now. I'm interested in marine emissions and our interactions with those emissions with anthropogenic activities and also anthropogenic emissions. And I'm very interested in the Salton Sea. And this was one of those topics where before I came to interview at Riverside, I had never heard of a massive lake in Southern California. I didn't know there was the 19th largest lake in the country, right there in the middle of inland Southern California. And when I arrived to do my interview and people were saying like, oh, you're probably here to work on the Salton Sea. And I had to like frantically Google to see what the heck the Salton Sea was. And indeed, it's this massive inland lake, not as large as your Great Salt Lake, but pretty big, especially to be completely off of my radar and not even realize that it was there in that location. And it turns out there are massive air quality issues. And as with many of these kinds of problems, as I know that you're aware of with your lake nearby here, it's very complex. There are many different factors that are coming together, including kind of global changes in terms of warming, changing precipitation patterns, changing policy, water and water rights, agriculture, all of these things kind of fit together into this complex system that's leading to this dried up lake bed surrounding the ring of this lake. And changes in the water quality, changes in air quality, all these things are topics that I've been working with other folks at UCR and elsewhere to try and get a better handle on what's happening. How can we better inform policy? Is there an ideal policy, to navigate through all these different types of options to enable us to kind of minimize negative impacts and maximize human health and well-being? So when we look at these kinds of problems,
well, before you is sharing your presenter view, not the
oh no. Okay, let me try this. I think I know how to fix that.
There you go. That looks good.
All right. Let me see if my clicker works here. Okay, and we have clicker working. Okay, I think we're all set here. As we look at this problem, this is of course not unique to Southern California. It's not unique to Utah. We see this issue of shrinking inland lakes, occurring worldwide. And with a few exceptions, we see this very common trend of reducing the footprint of these lakes. And this obviously has major ramifications for people that are in that area as far as just the water availability and of course what that water was covering, depending on what that water was used for, depending on what was flowing into these lakes. There's different types of sediments below each one. Each one of these lakes and all the similar lakes, you can see that Salton Sea gets a little mention over there. Of course, the Great Salt Lake features very prominently and has a nice little footprint there. And for each of these lakes, there are analogs, there are similarities, and there are also unique differences. And I think that this is one of those areas where, we studying the Salton Sea are very interested in networking and collaborating with others who are interested in this same problem, related to kind of water management, related to the future of these large lakes, and connected to the future of air quality and health for people around those lakes. So the Salton Sea. This was the one that up until 6 or 7 years ago, I had never heard of. You can see it on this map down here, a nice little kind of dimple right at the heart of inland Southern California. It actually inconveniently straddles the county lines. We have Riverside County to the north and then Imperial County to the south. Anytime that you're looking across borders, there's going to be issues with policy and management. This is something that comes up a lot when we're talking about the future of Salton Sea policy. You can see here, we've got this nice little picture. There are communities. This is to the north in the Coachella Valley. Coachella is maybe most famous for the festival that occurs there. But of course, there's many residents and people that live in this area. And then the Imperial Valley to the south is the home of basically our winter produce, largely comes from this very productive area that remains productive even through the winter months. Area-wise, we're looking at roughly a third of the Great Salt Lake. Which if we're doing this, if we're doing the Great Salt Lake justice, I should probably shrink that down a little bit like that. So, we're not looking at the same kind of scale. But interestingly enough, just like the Great Salt Lake, its historical footprint is much, much larger. So when we look, historically speaking, what we call now the ancient Lake Cahuilla once covered an area that's roughly analogous to the Great Salt Lake currently. So a huge area which floods the entire, almost the entire Imperial Valley and much of the Coachella Valley to the north used to cover this entire basin. What happened and what we see happening in the geologic record was actually a cycle of periodic inundations when we would see the Colorado River turn north and flood this entire basin, again, which we call Lake Cahuilla, and which the Salton Sea just makes up a small little fraction of that area now. And then periodic fluctuations in the path of that Colorado River outflow would cause that to turn back to the south and return to the Gulf of California, or to turn north and then flood that basin again. So this was something that we, on geologic timescales, was a very regular occurrence. We can see that happen. This is a nice little animation from the Redlands Institute. At one point, the entire valley was all part of that major Gulf finger that moved north. And then as outflows from the river system filled that interstitial area, we saw that kind of get cut off and dry up. Flooding events would occur that would then shift that pattern to the north, and we can see that inundation occurring. This would, this could take patterns of years to decades where we'd see that entire valley fill. And then again, different types of events could occur that would cause that river to move back to the south. So again, a cycle of kind of flooding, desiccation, flooding and desiccation was part of the ongoing history of this current system that we now know as the Salton Sea. A lot of things have happened since then. Of course, we have made a lot of changes to all the river systems. The Colorado River now is very much a managed system. We now control most aspects of its flow and its different and its outflows. And the current generation of the Salton Sea actually is pretty young. It was just over a century ago in 1905, a flood condition in the ongoing development of irrigation channels along the Colorado. A flood event caused a breach, which then spent a couple of years filling up what we currently know as the Salton Sea. A note here that I always like to point out when we're talking about this is that this particular event, if you go to the Wikipedia page for the Salton Sea, you'll see the Salton Sea is defined as being an anthropogenic origin lake, that it's man-made, quote unquote. And I always like to remind folks that the only unnatural part is that we were involved in its flooding, that this flooding event occurred regularly, very often. The natural state was that it was going to be flooding and drying up and flooding and drying up. This particular event, we were now sitting there by the sidelines, but the flood itself very likely may have happened whether or not we were involved in the damming and those types of construction. So, and this distinction, calling a lake natural versus causing a lake anthropogenic or man-made, it carries kind of implications. When you call something artificial, when you call something like man-made, it often carries the implication that it should not have been there in the first place, that it's somehow, that its mere existence is unnatural. And we hear this a lot when we're talking about the Salton Sea in California politics. So like, oh, it shouldn't have been there in the first place. It was just an accidental dam breach in 1905. But I think we have to be very careful about that when we think about what would the natural system have been? What would that kind of flood event have done? And also, what is our responsibility now being involved in those particular changes, in those particular events? So point being, regular flooding was in fact the norm for much of the physical, written, and oral histories that we have access to. The intersection of that natural and anthropogenic, of course, makes things very tricky in terms of liability and responsibility. Calling something natural, calling something unnatural is a loaded kind of distinction. So nowadays, it's a very different picture. We don't actually have any direct flows from the Colorado into the Salton Sea anymore at all. It's been completely removed. And now these rivers, the Alamo River, the Whitewater to the north, the New River is also down here. Oh, there it is right there. New River flowing up there. These are entirely fed by agriculture runoff. So these are entirely secondhand water flows. Where Colorado River is used to irrigate Imperial Valley crops and fields. And then those outflows then move out and fill the Salton Sea, which of course is an interesting kind of system in that we now have this basin that's almost entirely fed. There are, of course, it's a watershed, so there are some flows from the nearby streams and runoff there. But by and large, what's keeping the Salton Sea alive right now is entirely coming from crops. And you can imagine what that means in terms of the composition of the water that's flowing into the Salton Sea, right? So to kind of tackle this problem and to tackle this complex environmental system here, a few years ago, a team was put together, the Salton Sea Task Force at UC Riverside, that was very multidisciplinary. And the whole purpose of this task force was to kind of get a handle on all of these complex systems that make up our Salton Sea ecosystem and world here, and to look at them from the lens of a holistic view on what's going on with this particular basin. This was organized by the late Dr. Marilyn Fogel, who was really important in kind of catalyzing these types of efforts. We put together a nice little report. You can find that at saltonseataskforce.ucr.edu. The whole crux of which, this is one of the nice figures I like for that, is to organize kind of what we know and what we're kind of trying to know about the Salton Sea from different disciplines. With a large complex system like this, we need to have all those pieces in play. And so everything from, you know, the water policy that leads the Salton Sea's kind of upkeep, and then current evaporation, watershed hydrology, the water quality, the air quality, ecology, human health, and then geothermal resources, which is this ongoing and new kind of development. There's been geothermal resources harvested there for some time. You may have heard the term Lithium Valley pop up here because it has been discovered that these geothermal brines that were used to generate energy in this area are very rich in this valuable salt. You know, these lithium salts are easily extractable relative to other sources. And so there's been this big boom and interest in tapping into some of those geothermal brines and pulling the lithium out of that water. And so this has brought a lot of kind of buzz and money and research to the valley for better and worse. Of course, there's lots of things that go along with that. So what led to the state that it is right now? The Colorado River water rights, of course, were very contested as we start realizing what a powerful resource, you know, all this water was. And so in 1922, there was a compact made between 7 states. There was an agreement about allocations of all these different these water rights affected by the Colorado. You'll note, I think one thing that I think is very interesting to see here is that when this compact was made, here's 1922 right there, water levels, water outflows from the Colorado were at a stage that have never been since in terms of sustained outflows in the Colorado. So there was kind of a deal that was made in an era of abundance. And ever since then, when we look at the amounts of water coming out from the Colorado, it's been a downward trend. We did have a nice little spike here in the early 90s, late 80s. But in general, we've been seeing this kind of reduction overall in flows in the Colorado. And that's a trend that we expect to continue based on current projections. So there was a recent quantification settlement, the QSA. This was something that was made to kind of address some of these newer needs. Of course, it had been 80 years since they'd made these deals in the first place. And this was in part to resolve this request from San Diego to shift water from the Imperial Valley over to the urban areas. And this was a massive shift in water from the region, from the Imperial Valley over to the coast. And this had the effect of basically meaning that there was a lot less water going to the Salton Sea. Now, for 15 years, since that QSA was resolved, there was mitigation water that was planned out to keep the kind of Salton Sea water levels from dropping too far. That ended in 2018. And we've been seeing since then this ongoing drop, the steady decline, when we see these water levels going down. You can see even with the mitigation waters, we can see the levels of measured Salton Sea elevation dropping. We expect that to accelerate now that those mitigation waters are no longer going in, and to reach, without any form of kind of intervention, some form of new middle ground, a new equilibrium as we have evaporation match the lower inflows coming in there, which would which would result in a very different kind of footprint. So this is an estimate based on bathymetry of what that shoreline looks like at its current elevation, and what that might look like about 30 feet lower. And as we know, and this is true in the Great Salt Lake as well, a foot of elevation drop can mean a huge amount of change in the exposed surface areas, because these are not necessarily very steep or very deep water areas. So this is something that has caused a lot of concern, because we have, of course, all this area that's about to be exposed. We have a century of agricultural runoff that has contributed to these sediments, that has contributed to the buildup of these compounds and particles that may be underneath these water surfaces that are now going to be exposed to the open air. What do we see in the concentration, in the water quality itself? As might be expected, it's getting saltier and saltier, and it hasn't had as much time as the Great Salt Lake to build the kinds of really extreme salinities as you get in parts of your lake there. But you can see this change as soon as we start to see those elevations drop, or even before, we can see that salinity just really start to take off. And so it's ramping up very, very quickly. As we're seeing these concentrations, it's now over 70 parts per trillion. And that's actually a couple of years ago. It's probably well over that now. So far beyond the Pacific Ocean, working its way up towards Great Salt Lake levels. It's got a ways to go, of course. We also know that beyond salinity, beyond just those salts themselves, there's a lot of other compounds that are associated with that agriculture runoff, sulfur, nitrogen, phosphorus compounds that lead to a lot of different kind of biogeochemistry that happens in the lake as well. One of those is that we have seasonal algal blooms that periodically pop up there, gypsum blooms, as well as emissions of pollutants such as hydrogen sulfide. So these are, again, you see hydrogen sulfide in your Great Salt Lake as well. These are, again, some of these analogous problems that pop up in these kinds of systems. Net result, over time, we're seeing an increasingly emissive exposed land surfaces, increasingly concentrated water contaminants, which of course has folks concerned. So communities in the area of the Great Salton Sea, of the Salton Sea, are obviously concerned about the evolution of their lake. There has been a lot of asthma, in particular childhood asthma, that has been observed to the north and the south, some of the highest in the state. Exceeding even those other areas of dusty kind of conditions, similar desert environments. And there's a suggestion from other surveys that the Imperial Valley may have an even higher incidence. This is a map here from a paper recently published by a student in my group, Yanning Miao, who is looking at the correlation of these different types of health outcomes, along with ambient pollution levels and socioeconomic status data. So we're looking at kind of how these all overlap, how the health metrics that we look at differ from each other, and how we can use those to better understand these different influences on those health outcomes. And anecdotal reports have long suggested that some of these observed issues may be associated with proximity to the sea. So we see families note that when they leave the area, that some of their kids' symptoms, such as rashes, headaches, difficulty breathing, tend to go away when they're not living so close, when they go visit family in Mexico or are not in the area for a while. And so this all kind of inspired some of these questions about what might be the mechanisms responsible. Can we find a mechanism? Can we find what might be linking these particular exposures? What are the compounds? What are the pathways that might lead to these kinds of environmental drivers of health outcomes? If they exist, we need to go in and try and find, try and connect some of these dots. To analyze this, some of my colleagues at UCR, this occurred basically right after I arrived at Riverside. Dr. David Lowe there has been very instrumental in putting together this center, this NIH-funded center to address health disparities. One of the projects that they began with was to look at childhood asthma in the Coachella Valley region. Again, trying to explore these connections that may be present to connect what's happening in the Salton Sea to what residents are experiencing along its borders. The tools they've been using has been mouse chambers. So they've been collecting samples of sediment from different parts of the Salton Sea, as well as dust being collected far removed from the sea. And they've been exposing mice in the laboratory to these different kinds of dust samples. And what they find has been that these mice that are exposed to dust collected from the sea itself are showing a very unique kind of inflammation that is distinct, different, and more pronounced than inflammation that is exhibited by dust collected elsewhere. This is still kind of an outcome that's looking for the mechanism. We don't know the compound. We know where it was collected, and we know that it's connected to the Salton Sea. We're still working on kind of connecting some of those dots. But this was very suggestive that there may be something associated with these particular dust collection locations that could be tied to what's happening at the Salton Sea. One other thing of note that was very interesting in this result was that they found that it was not necessarily an allergic reaction that would be responsive to steroidal treatments, which is typically what's going to be given in the form of an inhaler. And so many of the families in the area would complain that the inhaler their doctor gives them is not helpful, that it doesn't address their kids' symptoms. This would be one of those kinds of things that ties that this type of inflammation would not necessarily be responsive to that intervention. So again, trying to find mechanisms that would provide effective interventions is one of these main goals. Another question that we're very interested in that could be related to this inflammation itself is fingerprinting the microbial communities in these dust particles. This is work that's being done by my colleague Emma Aronson and a student in her group, Linton Freund, and they've been taking all these different dust samples that are collected in passive samplers around the sea, and they've been running different types of genomic fingerprinting and looking at what types of microbiome differences they see. And we see here, although all the different genera are not important over here to know specifically, we can note that the genera that are prevalent in collections associated with dust are very, very different and distinct from those that are present in the seawater itself. And so we see different types of sources, different types of microbial fingerprints when we look at the water itself and say dust that's collected far away from the Salton Sea, which again could help us to understand what might be different as far as the eventual human health outcomes. One of the topics that I'm increasingly interested in is what might be coming from the water surface itself. Right now, almost all, and I can't, not even almost all of the mitigation efforts in terms of air quality that are being conducted around the Salton Sea right now are related to basically playa stabilization, putting up hay bales, surface roughening, vegetation. All of the work has been done, like how do we keep what's on the surface, which is good and important, and I think that's great. What I'm concerned with, and I'll show you why I'm increasingly concerned with this from my own work in just a moment, is what might be coming off of the water surface itself, and what might be mobilizing during windy events. There's very strong wind events that come through, strong dust storms. What might be coming off of the water surface itself? And so I'm increasingly interested in lake spray aerosol and what that might be contributing to the PM10. So when I first arrived, one of the first things I did was try and just get the lay of the land as far as like, what do we know about ambient air quality? What do we know about PM10 in the region? And we do have a handful of long-term stations. These are from the EPA's AQS network. You can see we have 4 stations to the north. We have 5 more to the south, and they kind of run the length of the valley. We can see just annual 95th percentile PM10 shown here in red. And you can kind of see where our patterns of high PM10 exist. And we also see seasonalities. Here we see diurnal cycles. I like to think in terms of days and weeks and months and seasons. And so I kind of categorize them by spring, summer, fall, winter, from midnight to midnight, as far as what's the typical diurnal patterns that we see there. And you'll note that we definitely see a nice diurnal pattern. When it gets dusty, we see a little morning peak, and then we see a late afternoon, evening peak there. And that this tends to be focused at stations that are closest to the Salton Sea. This is running roughly far north to far south. And so for PM10, we see, especially at those stations, this is the Mecca station running down to Brawley. That's these stations right there. At those 5 stations that are closest to the sea, we definitely see this strong spring and summer pattern. These are when windstorms are very prevalent in the basin. They're running through there, especially in the late afternoon, early evening. We kind of see those concentrations get up quite high. This is 400 micrograms per cubic meter at the top of my y-axis up here. And then we have, medians, and then running, I believe that's 5th to 95th ranges for our quantiles there for the shaded areas. We also see, so then moving forward beyond just kind of mass concentrations, I was also interested in the patterns of wind direction. Where's the wind coming from? There was a kind of a consensus, there was a common wisdom that, westerlies would mean that if there's anything coming from the Salton Sea or its surrounding dried lake bed, that it must be affecting these the communities to the southwest in the Imperial Valley the most because of dominant westerlies blowing from the coast. What we found when we dug into it, though, was that there's actually some really extreme and pronounced patterns, both on a monthly basis. Here we just see the directions of hourly winds organized here by month and by station. We can see that we have some shifting wind patterns that occur, of course, on a seasonal basis. And then on a daily basis as well, when we just limit to dust events, we see very strong diurnal patterns, where this is taken from the Indio station up here, where we can see this predominantly westerly early in the morning and late at night, shifts to more of a southerly direction during the day, and then shifts more to, we get more in the north and then again from the west as the evening progresses. Whereas in the south, we see this pattern of going from easterlies or westerlies shifting to from the south, and then again from the west as we move on. And of course, different conditions, different days, of course, will be driven by different events. We sometimes get these Santa Ana events that push, these cold airs from the desert off from the east. So we get lots of these different kinds of events that will occur and so we can get dust storms basically from both directions. All of which is meaning that if there's something being emitted from that Salton Sea region, whether it's the shore or the water itself, it's going to affect communities all around, different times of year, different times of day, driven by changing dynamics seasonally and diurnally. And of course, one of my biggest tools that I wanted to apply moving in here was like, let's start running some simulations. Let's start looking at dust emissions. Let's start looking at, WRF-Chem is a common model I like to use. CMAC is increasingly popular. in research circles and definitely in policy. And there's a lot of challenges. I know I don't need to say that to this crowd. There's a lot of challenges in doing really good dust modeling, especially true in this particular region. One of those was that we have very limited long-term surface observations. And so a lot of the kind of techniques that we might use to kind of constrict and to better understand these emissions, to constrain these emissions, we don't have a ton of input data to help to feed them, which is of course common in a lot of environmental justice communities. Satellite data, of course, is valuable. And so MODIS retrievals is one tool that we've been using to kind of try and get a handle on dust storms and regional dust events. One of the things that's unfortunate is that we don't usually have a retrieval for this area around the dustiest times of day. It doesn't quite match up with where we'd really like to see. The tempo is great, and we'd love to start using some of that ongoing data to better understand some of these diurnal patterns. And of course, dust emissions modeling is super sensitive to a lot of really fundamental parameters. Soil properties, soil moisture, let alone wind speeds, land cover, all these things are very, very important. And we're still getting a handle on all these different properties around the area. Complex topography, of course, that's true in this area as well. Whenever you get these mountainous regions, whenever you get air that's moving over these extreme changes in elevation, it gets trickier and trickier to get those wind speeds correct. I've been working with Amato Evan over at Scripps and UCSD to try and better understand what's happening with our topography and our dust storms. A little excerpt from one of our recent papers. So we are moving forward on trying to get our wind modeling improved. And that's one area where, of course, we definitely have a lot to learn from some of the work being done here. And then those surface properties themselves are super complex and dynamic. This is some work that's being done by the Imperial Irrigation District. They're taking some instruments that I know have been used around this area as well. It's a so-called PISWirl instruments to try and understand emissivities of different surface types. So characterizing different types of surfaces, whether it's dune or playa, different types of moistures, and trying to get a handle on what's happening with those emissivities under different conditions all around the sea. And then so far, the long and the short of it is that our modeling in terms of forward chemical transport modeling has a long way to go. I'm working on trying to improve some of these data sets and to integrate some of these improved data sets into our models. But currently, we need to do a lot of post-processing to get any sort of agreement between even so. So here's modeled AOD up here. This is from a paper by Charlie Zender and his group. And just an example of how challenging it can be to match up the AODs that we're seeing, say, from our model output with what we're seeing from other sources. And so there's a lot of work that we have yet to do on improving these types of model tools. So what can we do in the meantime? As we try and get some of these modeling tools developed, I was interested in also just contributing to strategies to help families directly right here and right now. One of the projects that we worked on, this was a project that was that began in February of 2022, was to put some monitors. These are the modular PM unit from QuantAQ, put monitors in homes and see what's happening in people's residences as these dust events are happening. This was something that a lot of community residents had spoken to us about as far as concerns. What's happening inside? If we bring our kids indoors, does that mean they're not going to be experiencing, if there's some particular toxic dust from these windstorms, how safe are we when we move inside? And so this was a project that was partially funded by NIH, as well as contribution from the Anthropocene Institute, and led by an amazing previous undergrad and current lab assistant, Ashley Trinidad, who's been really influential here. And the long and the short of what we found was that when we look outside to ambient air quality, we divided up roughly into terciles. So we looked at high conditions, meaning there's some sort of dust event happening outside, and then a mid and a low. And we can see what's happening indoors under each of these regimes. And the big takeaway message that we're seeing here, we're looking at indoor air quality, PM10, PM2.5, and PM1, as divided up by what's happening outside. The low and the mid are kind of overlapping. When we have low to middle conditions, there wasn't a huge impact from what's happening outdoors, it appears. When we have these dust events, as represented by the red there, we see a doubling or a tripling in most homes with PM levels indoors. And so this is indicating to us that infiltration was happening. Of course, there's a huge variability among homes, and that's driven by changing patterns in opening doors, opening windows, the quality of insulation and ventilation. All that contribute to a huge variability. But by and large, all homes showed some signal in terms of increases in that PM at all size distribution levels. when we're looking inside. We also, in this one, we used photo voice logs and interviews to get community experiences. So they would take pictures during dust events. They would talk about what that event meant for them and their family, what they saw in their kids when these dust events happened, as a way of kind of getting context for these events and how communities were experiencing them. One example of this, yeah, this is great. So this was last fall in October. There was a nice haboob that passed through the valley, and you can see just how dramatic these dust events are as it's just building up, this head of steam, it looks like, as it's moving across the valley. So this was a really massive dust event that was coming through. Outdoors, what did that look like? I had a couple QuantAQ devices that were measuring. This is at the yacht club that helpfully offered to host one of our instruments. And then UCR has a Palm Desert campus, which I had another device up there on the rooftop there. What did we see? Minute by minute, here we see as the haboob approaches, and then as that head passes through, we see concentrations exceeding 4,000 micrograms per cubic meter, and then tapering off as we see kind of the tail end of that event. At Palm Desert, it was even more dramatic. We had concentrations observed on a minute average basis of over 12,000 micrograms per cubic meter up on the rooftop of the UCR Palm Desert system there. So this massive kind of front moving through, and then kind of elevated conditions, still nearing 800, 900 micrograms per cubic meter sustained, throughout the day and night and into the next, early next morning.
Can I interrupt for
Yeah.
a question? Every picture that you're showing shows the Salton Sea at the same elevation. Maybe I missed it, but is the Salton Sea shrunk and some of the dust coming from the former lake bed, or is it coming from the surrounding?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. There has been excellent work put together by the Imperial Irrigation District. If you look for IID Salton Sea dust, they've done kind of an attempt at getting a budget for what we're expecting for dust around the area. The quick summary is that, as you would expect from an area that's literally surrounded by deserts on all sides, in terms of mass concentration, most of the dust is coming from surrounded deserts. That said, whenever you get high wind speeds along these surfaces there, you would expect that to pick up some passengers along the way. And so some of that dust we know is going to be coming from those sources. With these instruments, I'm only looking at total mass. So I don't have any way of doing any form of true source apportionment in this respect. But we do know just from, you could see this haboob coming well before it crossed the Salton Sea. So this is mostly desert dust that's coming through and hitting these communities. But yes, these wind speeds, these high wind speeds are going to pick up something along the way. And importantly, as that water level shrinks, we'd expect a contribution from that source to only increase. And that's partly what community folks were so concerned about. What's that look like inside? So here we see at the yacht club, we see those levels going up. Here's a home that was nearby, just a few miles away. So these are, we can assume to be roughly comparable to the ambient conditions outside the home. Down here in the gray, staying well below, say 50 micrograms per cubic meter, we see typical patterns of dust in this home for that day of the week at that time of day. So here's all the gray down there. Here's the dust that was measured. Here's the PM10 that was measured on the event on that day. That huge red spike right there matches up almost exactly with that spike that's measured on the ambient monitor, and that exceeds 800 micrograms per cubic meter as it goes up there. And then we can see periodically throughout the day, these presumably are timed with when people opened and closed doors, open and closed windows. We can see that infiltration coming in and causing that short-term spike before it then decays away over time. So interesting stuff. We are seeing this, of course, impacting homes. We know that it's impacting inside homes as well. But what about the source? Getting to your question, what can we say about the difference in health outcomes depending on where the dust was coming from? And this is a tricky problem. We don't have long-term speciation measurements. We don't have long-term, there have been passive sampling papers and studies done, generally kind of characterizing different dust sources, but we don't have anything close to, kind of a time resolved, even on a daily time basis, which we would need to do kind of hospitalization studies that would allow us to speciate and to really break apart those observed mass concentrations. So what can we do? Yaning and my group took a pretty clever approach, I think, where she was looking at using observed station measurements along with back trajectories to try and get a handle on what were the expected surface types contributing to these different dust sources. So we used existing, land cover databases to try and characterize all the surfaces that would be expected to contribute to dust observed around the region. And then we weighted back trajectories, high split back trajectories, which we ran for 15 years and correlated that with we tied that to the observed PM10 measurements for those stations up and down the valley to try and look at where was this dust coming from? How fast was the wind moving when it was moving over surfaces upwind? What's the expected erodibility of those surfaces as it was moving? And so we use these values, wind speed, the assumed the surface erodibility data sets, and then deposition over time to try and get a summed, we can't call it source apportionment, but we call it surface apportionment. What were the surfaces that this dust was traveling over before it was observed at a particular receptor site? And so we took the 6 that had the longest term measurements in that area, 3 to the north and 3 to the south. We then turned that into this kind of surface apportionment in terms of a total expected contribution to those observations at those sites. And we can see some things make sense. In the north, where we have a little bit more vegetation and land cover, we see more contribution from the shrub land surface type, for example. Where we have the stations closer to the Salton Sea, we get more of a contribution from the Salton Sea source, which we're agnostically defining as something from the water or its surrounding playa surfaces. And then we have an increasing contribution from south of the border from Mexico surfaces as we get further and further to the south. So although validation is ongoing, we've seen only consistent results with other existing data sets that kind of do elemental composition, for example. We are continually trying to do more validation of this. We think it's a potentially useful methodology that we can compare to other methods of looking at these kinds of sources. We then used a case crossover methodology to compare this with health impacts. And what this means, this was something that was new to me, and we're collaborating with some epidemiologists and health researchers at UCSD. The idea that we're doing here is that we're taking observed PM10 from all these stations. We're looking at hospitalizations in surrounding communities on a daily basis, and we're comparing any given day's hospitalizations to all other similar days of the week, same month of the same year. So for example, if we had a particular amount of hospitalizations on a Friday in July of 2016, we compare that to other Fridays in July of that same year so that we're controlling for different types of factors that can confound this type of analysis. What we're doing then is by comparing similar days of the week to similar months of the same year, we're allowed to then examine how the fluctuations in our concentrations of PM10 might be affecting those hospitalizations, all other factors being assumed to be controlled for by that case crossover methodology. So with this methodology, then we're able to then not only look at the total impact of PM10, but separate that out by the assumed surface origins of that PM10 that's arriving to that station. What do we see? We see that the Salton Sea contribution is fairly small. As I was just mentioning, overall, this is in line with other inventories and other expectations for what we think the total contribution of Salton Sea dust might be. Nice little sliver there. This is at the Mecca station, which is just to the north. However, when we run that through our case crossover analysis, we see that the Salton Sea is one of the highest. And on to the right here, that means that there's more of an impact on hospitalizations. So above one is kind of our neutral line. 1 would mean that there's not much of an effect or no effect. Above 1 means there's elevated hospitalizations. We can see that a lot of these bars, this is for one station. This is a very data hungry technique. So our ranges of uncertainty bars are quite large. All of them overlap with the 1 line, right? Even the one for the Salton Sea, which is maybe the most positive of all of them. So this was for one site for those 15 years of health data. What happens when we pool them all together? When we pool them all together and we just take a look at the Salton Sea origins, this means that we're looking at dust that passed directly over the Salton Sea. We're counting that as our kind of our important separated source. We see a very clear, completely above the 1 line signal for PM10 that's associated with that Salton Sea surface type, which again, mechanism-wise, we don't know. Is this being picked up by playa surfaces? Is this being blown off of the water? We do see that whatever might be the source, there are elevated hospitalizations above and beyond what we would see from all other surface types combined. So this seems pretty suggestive. This is for respiratory hospitalizations. We even see a positive, although much higher uncertainties for cardiovascular disease hospitalizations, which was a head scratcher for me. I hadn't thought about what the link to cardiovascular disease might be. And so to further understand this, one of our medical students actually heard about this and was saying, oh, cyanobacteria has links to cardiovascular disease. Could there be an algal or bacterial connection? So we used MODIS data to look at the chlorophyll A data product on a remote sensing basis. And then we assigned any trajectory points passing over the Salton Sea to algae event or non-algae event, depending on what the state of the extent of that algal bloom might be, as given by the chlorophyll A data product. We then repeated the case crossover health analysis, repeating with those two distinct types, algal event, non-algal event. This is what we see. Stronger association, the stronger signal, this was about 1.08, meaning approximately 8% increase in hospitalizations, goes up to about a 25% increase in hospitalizations associated with, this is normalized by mass. So this is assuming a 10 microgram per cubic meter increase in particles from that particular surface type. But it's very, very clear that the Salton Sea during an algae event is particularly associated with that increase in hospitalizations. A similar, there is a positive, but the uncertainty ranges there. Our confidence intervals don't stay above 1 for the Salton Sea during non-algae events. And then an also positive, but more uncertain association still with the cardiovascular disease hospitalizations. Is there cyanobacteria in the Salton Sea? Quick answer is that yes, it has been measured in small quantities. As recently as 2020 and 2021, surveys have shown at least 12 genera of cyanobacteria, which again have been associated with many different health outcome problems, including cardiovascular disease as well. So this is something that I think is, this, by the way, this is very new. This is stuff that we've just been working through and processing this year. And I think it's very potentially impactful on how we think about policy in this area. Hay bales along the shoreline is not going to address this particular problem. And so this would be something where if this is tied to what's happening on surface waters, it may represent a need for a shift in the way that we're treating our interventions here. So what can we do? One of my recent projects has been to try and clean that indoor air. I mentioned that we saw that there was indeed a big impact for infiltration and dust events getting inside those homes. We've been going down to the Coachella Valley and Imperial Valley and building tons of these low-cost DIY air filters, so-called Corsi Rosenthal boxes, basically just 4 HVAC filter panels duct taped to a box fan. Studies have shown they're remarkably effective. The papers are out. They're very, very good at cleaning indoor air. We've been holding workshops to help participants build these boxes for themselves, deploy them in those homes, and then we use monitors to gauge their efficacy. So we've got those same sensors that have been put into homes. At a certain point, we hold a workshop and get a filter in those homes. We're looking at how that changes that indoor environment once we begin filtration. I just finished a couple weekends of workshops down there. We've built about 60 of these boxes so far for our participants. We've got 20 more planned, total of 50 participants. So in the end, we hope to have 100 of these filters built for community participants. And we can then monitor and watch their impact on that indoor air quality. How well do they work? This is from one of those workshops. This is just from 2 weeks ago. I set up one of my little QuantAQ boxes to kind of measure what's happening with PM 2.5 in that room. What you're seeing here is PM 2.5 on the y-axis there with micrograms per cubic meter. We can see the workshop begin. I plugged in my little box, and this is minute by minute what's happening with that PM 2.5. Right around here, we finished our little intro presentation and they start building their boxes. There's lots of like cardboard sawing. So presumably a lot of these particles is just like cardboard residue that's popping off of these saws. Right around here, if you can guess what happened at this point, the boxes started being finished and turned on. 2 of our participants who finished their boxes first, I asked them to go ahead and plug them in so we could test them. So we plugged in the 2 boxes right there. Right off the bat, we see this huge drop in that indoor PM 2.5 mass concentration, down to the point where here they took their boxes and went home. So right around there, and you can see, as soon as those boxes are removed, we see those concentrations begin to go back up. So this is one that I shared with our participants. I think it's a nice little plug for the efficacy of these boxes in their homes. Again, trying to keep them motivated to get these things running. Other things that we're doing, there's a whole bunch of outreach and communication efforts. I think these are things that are important. I know these are other efforts that are happening around the Great Salt Lake as well. There's been a huge increase in awareness with the Great Salt Lake issues and what are the consequences of inaction, essentially. And so we've been releasing these little science comics. Dr. David Lowe has been responsible for putting a lot of these together. This one you can see was made when I first arrived. I hadn't developed my professorial beard yet. So I took the liberty of kind of, helping out a little bit there. We have other comics that look at kind of like helping people to understand what is asthma, what happens, what's happening in the Salton Sea as we have all these different contaminants go into the water. What does it mean when you have trouble breathing, and how can kids and families better understand all these different, from start to finish, how these different factors might be affecting their health. And I think this is, one of those important ways alongside our papers to try and make our findings and our research really digestible and translated into community formats. I'll wrap up here just with a little shout out to the rest of my group. I mentioned work from a couple of the members of my group, Yanning Miao and Ashley Trinidad. Other members of my group, graduate students and postdocs. I just was told today that my website is down, so you can write this down, but you won't be able to find anything yet. I'm going to figure out what's going on with that, and so hopefully that'll be fixed up pretty soon. And I'll just end with some closing thoughts here, which you can read for yourself, and I'm happy to answer any questions if there's time.
Anybody questions? Yeah, Colin.
I don't know anything about medicine. So in the medical world, you're using PM10 because you measure PM10, but is PM10 the smoking gun? Is it the thing that's most related to asthma and CBD instances and hospitalizations for respiratory issues? Or are there another multitude of variables?
Yeah, we don't know. In the literature, PM 2.5 is the big one, right? And the conventional wisdom is that PM 2.5 and the fine particles can infiltrate deeper into the lungs. They can get more quickly into bloodstreams. They can contribute to issues faster and easier. We looked at PM10 here. We also those stations also measure PM 2.5. What we were interested though in particular was windblown dust. And of course, the windblown dust size distribution is going to lean coarse. And so we're operating under the assumption. In fact, we tried to, we included PM 2.5 as a covariate to try and remove that from our regressions, because we were specifically interested in that windblown dust fraction. So could some of those impacts that we were looking at with PM10 be noise and correlation with PM 2.5? Absolutely could. We've tried to, as much as possible, to pull that out so that we could zero in on what I think is less well understood, which is the impact of PM10. And that's, I think, what makes some of those positive R values there particularly striking, in that it's coarse mode stuff, which is by conventional wisdom not supposed to be as impactful on some of these health outcomes. Yeah.
If the picture that you've shown of the Salton Sea, which we've all seen many times, if you call that 100% of the area, what is the current fractional area? In other words, the Great Salt Lake has been down way under 50%.
Yep.
From the title of your talk, I thought you were going to tell us that the Salton Sea has been shrinking. Apparently not.
Oh no, it very much has. Let me go back to, or let me zip back to one of my early
series.
Yeah. Let me show you that part. That itself is not. There's no question as far as what's happening with that. Let me show you this figure here. So here we see the elevation, and this is running from, you would call it the current version of the Salton Sea occurred in 1905. We can see the big spike up here, and here we have the elevation. So here's the water of elevation above. Yeah, so this is it's below sea level. So we have negative values here in meters. We can see that it peaked, in that early event of flooding. We can see that soon after, when they repaired that breach, it then dropped very quickly until it started being fed by that agricultural runoff. And then it rose through the 20th century. Around here was kind of the heyday of the Salton Sea. It was touted as the Tahoe of the South. Everybody was building their homes down there, their winter homes. It started to smell as fish started dying. And so all the rich folks, they packed up and moved to the coast. And so you can see that the current then boom there peaked in the 80s and 90s, and it's been on a downward trajectory ever since. This trajectory is expected to continue until it's below this level down here. And so the projection right now is basically just an onward decline from the existing trajectory. And as you would expect, if you go down to the Salton Sea, it remains beautiful, by the way. I encourage, on clear, non-dusty days, I encourage people to go and visit. You see all the hallmarks of this particular trend. When you're talking about a drop of what, 5 meters over the course of that 20 years there. You'll see abandoned docks, where the water is, 100 feet away, where it used to be deep enough where you could have a boat moored at this particular now empty dock. And it makes a very kind of chilling scene. And I know that you're seeing this played out, in the Great Salt Lake as well, when you have all these areas that used to be inundated and they're now just completely barren. And that same thing is occurring at the Salton Sea.
It's interesting if you're getting more exposed lake bed area surrounding it, but it'll be interesting if you can actually the dust impact separate from the algal impact on.
Yeah, that's one of the big questions. And there's
the water,
yep.
and it's going to make it better when there's less water, or is it coming from the dust?
Exactly.
Worse when there's more.
I think that's one of the remaining $1 million questions, and that's going to really inform what the best mitigation strategy is. I mentioned Dr. Lowe, who's been, basically giving mice doses of inhaled dust. One of his next projects is to look at this question of the water versus
algae.
Yeah. So we have to tie that chlorophyll A data product. We have to tie that to direct in situ measurements. We have to then tie that to actual laboratory epidemiological studies. And I think then the next step would be, a population level trial to look at these health outcomes in more detail. But I think that the dots are starting to be connected in terms of kind of piecing together this puzzle.
John?
Can you walk me through the sort of processes involved, health impact and algae? You have a silent bacteria. What happens? You have to explain.
That's the mechanism that I'm proposing as a possibility here. So the sea exhibits these periodic events where we'll have these massive algal blooms, then associated increases. Presumably, this has not been established experimentally yet, in bacteria that will feed on these algal blooms. If those are causing increases in concentration of harmful bacteria at the surface, then lake spray aerosol that's picking up when these dust events and these high wind events come over the water, the mechanism would then be picking up these droplets, which then contain those harmful bacteria in them. And so even then, when the drop dries up, it then would become a crystal of something with salts or whatever. Those bacteria would presumably remain on that. And so that would be just a little carrier mechanism to get that to communities.
Dr. Lowe is going to feed that to the mice.
He'll be collecting water samples during, and I'm hoping he will soon be collecting water samples during and not during observed algal events. And so that would help to then constrain whether that's whether that's one of the important knobs in terms of how this is affecting health. Yeah, I don't want to make promises for him. He's told me he's interested in doing that, so I'll see what he puts together.
I think it might be related to the first question, but when you showed your plots of the change in the health effects by land type, all of your other land type ones were floating around 1. Is that unusual if we expect particles to have some sort of health impact? Is it because you're filtering out that PM2.5 that you're not seeing?
Yeah. I think that would be, again, PM10 in general is not what people focus on in general with these kinds of outcomes. So I don't know. And also you'll notice that, there's many more observations than for all other surfaces combined than for the Salton Sea. I'll also note that we're lumping them all together in here. There's other surfaces that display intriguing positive values. In particular, one of the ones that Yaning has continued to work on has been, if we look at the air masses that have come over agricultural croplands, it's above 1. And so that's something we're very interested in looking at, whether either windblown dust or even if there might be some fine particulates coming from ammonia or other types of emissions that could be associated with those health impacts. So we're lumping these all together, but we do see kind of other intriguing patterns.
So then to average that out, you need some that are less than 1.
Yeah.
Which kind of implies that you're getting some dust that would
make you feel better. Yeah.
Which seems...
I will also mention that, looking at daily hospitalizations is an imperfect metric. So for example, let's think of a hypothetical scenario where there's a dust storm, but everyone goes into perfectly insulated homes. They have less exposure to pollution and they don't go to the hospital as often. Did the dust cause them to be healthier? Well, no, they just didn't breathe it. So there's many ways that other types of behavioral confounders could get in here that could make the illusion that there's actually a positive benefit. But of course, we don't actually believe that inhaling any sort of dust is good for you, right? Yeah.
Just continuing talking about these. I guess do you have sort of intuitive explanation for what the y-axis sort of represents? Well,
Yeah.
I guess the first question is, these are normalized by the concentration?
Correct. So these are normalized to a 10 unit increase, which would be 10 micrograms per cubic meter
So
for this particular pollutant.
can you make any kind of claim like for a 1% increase in the Salton Sea being the source, you see some percent increase in
Yeah.
concentration?
In this case, not on a percent basis, but what this is suggesting is that a 10 microgram per cubic meter increase in particulates originating from the Salton Sea corresponds to a roughly 8.4% increase in daily hospitalizations for respiratory disease. That's what those numbers are.
We've got time for one more question. So Brenda, yeah.
You mentioned gypsum blooms.
Yeah.
Can you say a little bit more about that? Is it associated with the algal blooms, and might that be a source?
Yeah, so the gypsum is, of course, it's a mineral, and it's something that occurs when we have particular types of events with turnover, where we have a huge mass condensation of all these dissolved minerals into solids. And you can see these very visibly from space and by the naked eye. And so those, and this is where it's getting, the water chemistry and water quality gets a field from my expertise. So I defer to the experts on my team who study that in more detail. But my understanding from what they tell me is that they do have connections, but they don't necessarily mean that they're both happening at the same time. And one of our goals is to actually separate some of that chlorophyll A data product to confirm chlorophyll versus gypsum, because they have very different kinds of implications. Both of them occur. Both of them happen.
In the gypsum too.
Yeah, you could. From what I understand, when the gypsum occurs, though, it's not good conditions for bacteria, though, which would make our interpretation problematic, unless the gypsum is somehow harmful, which I also don't understand that at all. So I would have to defer. We need more understanding to answer that.
That will give our speaker round of applause. And any other questions?
One of these and I.